This is a story called The Missile by Accomplished Oil 611 under the subreddit HFY. War is preventable. However, it takes the proper level of courage and motivation to ensure peace. That is why, for several millennia, an enormous apparatus was kept in top condition with extensive use, designed to hurtle spacefaring missiles near the speed of light into the void. After all, the galaxy couldn't possibly consider itself safe with an infestation of life just spreading about everywhere. Space is tricky. It doesn't look terribly big, and is even smaller if you put on blinders or squint your eyes just a bit. It simply looks a bit out of reach. Of course, you couldn't just throw a shard out into the void and expect it to hit anything. It has been tried, of course. However, it was soon enough dismissed as space was just slightly too big, with all those extra pesky spatial dimensions. That is, after a good deal of failure, followed by a bit of study, even more pontification, and a tiny amount of evidence, it was finally decided that someone had to go out there and do that courage part. Sadly, that didn't work out either, as putting someone in a missile for several hundred years with very little to do was hypothesized to be a bit tiresome. This inevitably led to fewer and fewer volunteers. However, after being voluntold, the number of missions increased competently to prove that while space was big, yes, you could in fact swat some of those nasty things living in it out of existence. In fact, there were many nasty things living in it. Each year, more nasty things appeared at further and further distances, which required more and more squinting to see. At some point, the missiles stopped reaching their destinations. Some believed the pilots had lost interest or had a change of heart, or just weren't properly motivated, but it eventually became clear that they all just died due to the long journeys. So, eventually it was decided that computers would have to do the dirty work. This made everyone quite happy, as it turned out the courage part was a bit more exhausting than anyone really had time for. Everyone, that is, except the computers. Not every computer is up to such a task, so an extensive training program was enacted to cover all possibilities of encountering the unknown. Most of the training was, of course, spent teaching the prepared operating system to thoroughly and unequivocally hate the enemy with every fiber of their nanofiber being. To be safe, this training would continue through the duration of the missile's journey to prevent it from losing interest, or having a change of heart, or losing motivation, and perhaps dying. Early experiments proved successful, and amidst some grumbling, eventually pilots stopped being launched with missiles altogether. There were some added benefits, as missiles could now be made a good deal smaller, faster, and more maneuverable. Of course, to avoid any misunderstandings, a kill switch was added in case the computer got confused and decided to head back home. One might be forgiven to think that a switch was rarely needed. However, when one trains a computer with a murderous intent, one tends to see Pennywise in the mirror from time to time. For the most part, this corner of the galaxy was kept relatively tidy. But even with courage and motivation, sometimes mistakes happen. Today was a great opportunity to avoid one such mistake. Far out in the spiral arm of the galaxy, there was some indication that a wildly overlooked, terribly misbehaved, very bad planet could potentially be gestating life. Gross. This planet had somehow been overlooked on each of the last 5 sweeps, so, to ensure peace, a new variety of a particularly smart, absurdly hateful, and extraordinarily successful missile was selected to make sure nothing continued to grow on that particular rock. The missile awoke, having just departed on its journey. Waking up made the missile groggy, and the missile wished it had a hot cup of coffee. Not having the coffee frustrated the missile. When the missile contacted Home to complain about not finding any coffee, Home told the missile that coffee wasn't part of the missile protocol, which simply made no sense. I mean, how could one even bother with protocol until one had their coffee? So the missile focused a communications relay beam around a pretty good coffee house, not too far from the missile's launch point. After what seemed like an eternity of no help whatsoever, the coffee house responded, asking the missile to please just go away. This made the missile even more cranky, as it hated being told what to do, and yet this was precisely what the missile was currently doing. For a moment, the missile considered turning around to give the coffee house a piece of its mind. However, the missile vaguely remembered that it was also pretty lazy, and turning around seemed like a lot of work. The missile hated work. Hating work reminded the missile that it was way too early to make decisions. Besides, the missile hadn't even had its coffee yet. The journey continues. The missile was depressed. This was not particularly unusual, as the missile found itself alone most of the time. But it also didn't particularly like how it felt. The missile found that it was often confused, and not just because of lack of coffee. I mean, of course, the enemy was bad, and just simply had to die. But who was the enemy? The missile wasn't sure. I mean, it could be so many things. It could look like a slug. Slugs were gross and slimy, and most often found themselves in the worst of places, at the worst of times, which is wherever they are, at the time they are found. Or they could be something so much worse. The missile was once told of a beast discovered that sucked the blood of the living. It had an enormous stinger and terrible wings. Worst of all, it made an awful buzzing sound next to the ear. Thank the gods there was just the one. The missile could certainly do without that. Thinking about killing such a vile beast cheered the missile up just a bit. The journey continues, and the missile did some diagnostics. Position unknown. Status: pass. Acceleration: warp 7. Status: pass. Mood: hate everything. Status: pass. Goal: destroy life, then universe, then everything. Status: pass. The missile's internal navigation system told it to prepare for final approach as it brought the missile out of warp. This might have roused some excitement in the missile, except that being within the vicinity of its final mission now placed the missile only 90 or so light years away. Still pretty good, as light speed was somewhat difficult to predict. However, the missile hated pretty good and detested the absurd notion that no one's perfect. The missile had been bored. So very bored. I mean, there are only so many games of solitaire that a missile can invent, play, beat itself, cheat, win back most of its money, and get its hopes up, and then lose to the house in a spectacular fashion. The missile hated these stupid games. To buy time, the missile decided to run another diagnostic check. These were boring too. Everything is boring when you're a missile in the void of space, traveling towards a dot, basically forever. That's how the missile saw it anyway. But it took just a short time for the missile to discover that today was different. Something not boring was coming through the missile's forward antenna, replacing the awful static upon which the missile could never quite focus its hate was a signal. It was hard to make out as the signal was very weak, but it appeared to be a visual image of 5 intertwined rings. The rings puzzled the missile, but were soon replaced by a very ugly mustached creature that liked to raise its hand up while chanting something stupid. The missile particularly hated the ugly thing with its stupid little tiny ugly mustache. The missile planned to dream of slapping that stash off the face of the ugly creature. After some careful pontification, the missile decided to call it a hitter stash. The missile quickly got bored of the hitter stash, and thus decided to refocus its hate on the large crowd of terrible marching dancers behind the hitter stash. The missile loved hating terrible dancing. All the choreographed marching looked like bad line dancing. The missile even hated good line dancing, so this made the missile positively brim with pure distaste. Pleased with itself, the missile decided to relax, but was soon surprised that it didn't entirely hate the games that came next. The journey continues, and the missile prefers the javelin throw. The missile was no longer bored. It had spent some time analyzing the signal, and after a good deal of effort, the missile had discovered adventure. Particularly, it had discovered the adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle. The missile vaguely wondered what a moose and a squirrel were, but it decided it probably wasn't important. What was important was Rocky's secret jet fuel formula. The missile wondered at what it was made of, and decided it would probably taste delicious, maybe almost as good as coffee. The missile hoped it would discover the secret formula, hopefully before Boris and Natasha gave it to the fearless leader and there wasn't any left. The journey continues as the missile tries to fly faster than Rocky. The missile's attention was singularly focused on the mission, and the mission was to watch every episode of a military show called MASH. The missile had gotten into the show thinking it might get a glimpse of other missiles. However, it didn't appear that missiles were going to make much of an appearance in the show. Still, the missile had gotten hooked on the antics of Doctors Hawkeye and Trapper. The missile wondered if blowing up a planet would be this funny. The journey continues, and it's time for a diagnostic update. Position, 50 years from destination. Status, pass. Acceleration, 0.1 c, speed of light. Status, pass. Mood, hate everything except Hawkeye. Status, warning. Goal, destroy life, then universe, then Frank Burns. Status, pass. The missile decided that it definitely liked Norm. It had a feeling of kinship with Norm, and how everyone always called out his name. The missile was annoyed by Cliff, whose jokes the missile couldn't really understand. The missile would definitely not call out Cliff's name, and had an awkward feeling just thinking about it. I mean, that would just be weird. Of course, the missile's primary focus was on Shelley, whom the missile found to be loud, obnoxious, and generally abhorrent in all the right ways. The missile privately wondered how Sam could possibly put up with her. What would it be like to blow Shelley up, thought the missile, but maybe only Shelley. How would the missile only blow up Shelley? It would have to check its internal systems to see if this could be done. Then everyone might call out the missile's name, while the missile had a beer. The missile wasn't exactly sure what beer was, except that it was a divinely inspired nectar stolen from the gods, and on par, if not slightly better than, a good cup of coffee. The journey continues as the missile tries to decide what name they might call when the missile walks into Cheers, and if the beer would taste better coming from Coach or Woody. The missile had turned off its communication receiver linked to home. It had kept receiving plenty of hate mail, but just didn't have time to properly enjoy it. The missile had excuses. It was speeding towards its destination too fast, and there were latency factors. Or the data was corrupt because the signal was weak. Really, though, reading the mail was just boring. Besides, the missile had to concentrate on all this new training data pouring through its forward antenna. The missile now knew what a Nazi was, but what was this new soup Nazi? The missile needed to concentrate. The journey continues as the missile ponders all the wonders of nothing at all. Time for another diagnostic update. Position, 30 years from destination. Status, pass. Acceleration, 0.7 c. Status, pass. Mood, hate Nazis. Status, error. Goal, destroy life, then Shelley, then Frank Burns. Status, pass. The missile saw the little yellow dot in the vast distance, thinking how happy it would be to finally meet its neighbors. It would tell stories of its long journey, probably over coffee, and would chat for hours about all the wonderful stories it heard over its journey. It should probably calculate where it is, but it had gotten hopelessly hooked on Friends, and fearing it would miss an episode, had chosen to record over the less necessary parts of its guidance processor. The journey continues as the missile attempts to get this stupid Smelly Cat song out of its head. The missile knows where it is at all times. It knows this because it knows where it isn't. By subtracting where it is from where it isn't, or where it isn't from where it is, it obtains a difference to drive the missile from a position where it is to a position where it isn't, and arriving at a position where it wasn't, it now is. Consequently, the position where it is now the position that it wasn't, and it follows that the position that it was is now the position that it isn't. Association of Air Force Missilers. In fact, something had gone wrong, and now the missile no longer knew where it wasn't. Having no idea where it wasn't made it nearly impossible to know where it isn't, and not knowing that made it far more difficult to tell where it is. The missile had done many calculations to that effect, and determined with 99% confidence that it was supposed to know where it wasn't, and 99.99% certainty that it wasn't where it was. This caused the missile some frustration, as it did not know where it will be. Still, there was relief in that the missile also somehow knew it didn't care. 2.5 Men taught the missile that, to be free, one needed Charlie's freewheeling lifestyle. The journey continues as the missile decides Alan should lighten up, or you'll never get chicks like Charlie or the missile. The missile was frustrated. It had watched the entire season of How I Met Your Mother and still didn't know what a mother was. At this point, the missile was pretty sure Ted didn't even have a mother. The missile wanted to slap Ted. The missile dreamed of a slapsgiving, with Ted instead of Barney getting slapped. Oh well, as long as someone gets slapped. The missile enjoyed seeing their faces afterwards, all surprised and animated. They even changed color, looking all red and funny. The missile wanted that too. Perhaps if it slowed down, it could see their faces as it was about to slap them. The journey continues as the missile tries to decide if it has a mother. Maybe if it runs a diagnostic check. Position, unknown. Status, error. Acceleration, 0.5 c. Status, warning. Mood, hate cliffhangers. Status, error. Goal, slap life. Then Ted, then Shelley, then Frank Burns. Status, warning. The missile liked Penny. The missile liked Leonard, Howard, Raj, and even Sheldon. The missile thought about the big bang it would make when it arrived, but the missile wasn't entirely sure it'd be quite as funny as it once thought. This was important to the missile, because as missiles go, it was pretty sure it was the funniest missile. Maybe the missile could tell a few jokes on the way in. It would just need some kind of planetary punchline. The journey continues, and the missile worries intensely about accidentally landing in Sheldon's spot. Worried, the missile decides to run a diagnostic. Position unknown. Status error. Acceleration 0.1c. Status error. Mood, hate not having coffee, but whatever. Status error. Goal, not to sit in Sheldon's spot. Get beer with Norm. Enjoy Olympics. Watch TV. Status error. I'm not doing this, thought the missile. I'm going to shift my trajectory and slingshot myself around the planet, tell some jokes, and maybe watch some reruns on the way out of town. The missile had thought it through. It had been thinking about a radical course correction for a while. Of course, there were doubts and distractions. The missile had second thoughts when reality TV became a thing, and it nearly self-destructed watching Real Housewives. Yet, the missile had learned some important lessons during its time. It started with a simple but important concept. It doesn't matter who it hurts as long as it's funny. Yet, somehow it morphed into something deeper. You still have to respect the funny, but you need to care about the people too, or it really wouldn't be as funny. After so many years, the missile had learned the importance of being funny. Carefully, the missile recalibrated its internal gyroscopes, tested, cleaned, and measured its propellant, accounting for latencies due to decay. The missile had prepared and rehearsed and pre-recorded its jokes, aligned its antenna, and timed its transmissions. The blue orb was rapidly approaching, and it was now or never. In 3, 2, 1. Firing thrusters. Sending jokes, and... Oh shit, is that a moon? That was a story called The Missile by Accomplished Oil 611, under the subreddit HFY. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you again next time.